The evening air of Harlem carried the heat of early summer as the sun slowly dipped behind the skyline of Manhattan. Saturday, June 13th, 1964, had been an ordinary day for most of New York, but Harlem had its own rhythm, its own heartbeat. On 125th Street, music spilled out of record shops, vendors called out to passing crowds, and the sidewalks pulsed with life. People laughed, argued, flirted, and dreamed, unaware that a single moment was about to echo across the city. Sleek black Cadillac pulled to the curb near a row of boutiques and cafes. The driver stepped out first, opening the rear door with quiet respect. Mamie Johnson emerged gracefully, dressed in a cream-colored suit and dark sunglasses that reflected the neon lights of Harlem. Beside her stepped her teenage daughter, elegant and composed, her posture revealing a quiet confidence inherited from her parents. To most people, they were simply a well-dressed mother and daughter enjoying an evening in the city. But to Harlem represented something far more powerful: the family of Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. Mamie held her daughter's hand as they began to walk toward a nearby store. She had learned long ago how to move through Harlem with dignity, ignoring whispers and glances. Life beside Bumpy Johnson had taught her strength, patience, and silence. She knew the streets watched everything, and she also knew that respect was the invisible currency that ruled Harlem more than money ever could. As they walked, the crowd parted naturally, some people nodding politely, others pretending not to stare. The driver had stepped away briefly to handle an errand, leaving them to wait for a few moments on the sidewalk. The city's noise surrounded them: car horns, distant sirens, laughter, and the faint sound of jazz drifting from a nearby club. Then, from across the street, a man stumbled forward. He was in his late 30s, his clothes wrinkled, his steps unsteady. The smell of alcohol followed him like a shadow. At first, no one paid attention. Harlem was used to men like him, loud, careless, and unaware of the lines they were crossing. But as he drew closer, his eyes narrowed when he noticed Mamie and her daughter. He stopped a few feet away. The street seemed to slow down. His voice rose, sharp and ugly, cutting through the warm evening air. His words were reckless, filled with bitterness and ignorance. Conversations nearby stopped. People turned their heads. Some froze, others looked away, knowing instinctively that they were witnessing something dangerous. Mamie Johnson did not respond. Her face remained calm, almost expressionless. She had learned that silence could be stronger than anger. She gently squeezed her daughter's hand, her fingers tightening just enough to reassure her. Her daughter looked up at her mother, confused and shaken, but she said nothing. For a brief moment, the world felt suspended. The man laughed, thinking he had won something. He muttered another insult under his breath and staggered away, disappearing into the crowd as quickly as he had appeared. Harlem had seen everything. A few men standing outside a barber shop exchanged glances. A bartender watching from his doorway quietly stepped back inside. A street vendor lowered his voice. People who understood Harlem's unwritten rules knew that something irreversible had just happened. Mamie and her daughter continued walking, their steps steady, their heads held high. When the driver returned moments later, he noticed the tension in the air, but said nothing. The Cadillac door opened again, and they stepped inside without a word. The car rolled away, merging into the traffic of New York City. To outsiders, it was just another small incident in a crowded city. But in Harlem, small incidents had long memories. Within minutes, whispers began to move faster than cars on Broadway. In gambling houses hidden behind grocery stores, in jazz clubs thick with smoke. In back rooms where men spoke quietly over whiskey, the story began to spread. Someone had insulted Bumpy Johnson's family. By the time the Cadillac disappeared into the night, Harlem already knew that this was not just an insult. It was a declaration of ignorance, and ignorance in the world of Bumpy Johnson was something New York would soon regret. The restaurant in Midtown Manhattan was quiet in the way only powerful places could be. Soft lights glowed against dark wooden walls, and the hum of polite conversation floated beneath the clinking of glasses and silverware. Outside, New York rushed through the night. Inside this private dining room, time seemed to move more slowly. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, sat at the center of the table, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He wore a tailored dark suit, his tie perfectly aligned, his hands folded calmly in front of him. To strangers, he looked like a businessman enjoying a late dinner. To the men around him, he was something else entirely, a man whose words could change destinies. The meeting had been going on for nearly an hour. Names were mentioned quietly, numbers exchanged, agreements discussed in coded language. Bumpy listened more than he spoke. He had learned long ago that true power did not announce itself. A soft knock interrupted the conversation. The door opened slightly, and Frank Lucas stepped inside. He did not greet anyone. His eyes went directly to Bumpy. The room felt the shift instantly. Bumpy raised his hand gently, signaling the others to pause. He stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, and walked toward Frank with measured steps. They moved toward the corner of the room, away from curious ears. Frank leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Something happened in Harlem," he said. Bumpy did not react. "Speak clearly," he replied. Frank hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "A man disrespected Mrs. Johnson and your daughter on 125th Street this evening." For a brief moment, the sounds of the restaurant faded in Bumpy's mind. His face remained calm, but something behind his eyes changed. It was not rage. "What kind of man?" Bumpy asked quietly. "Drunk," Frank said. "Careless." He spoke loudly. "People saw it." Bumpy nodded once. He did not ask how Mamie had reacted. He already knew. Mamie never caused scenes. She never needed to. "Names?" Bumpy asked. "Yet," Frank replied. "But we'll find him." Bumpy turned slightly, looking out the window at the glowing lights of Manhattan. Cars moved like veins of fire through the streets below. New York looked peaceful from above. He knew better. "Find everything," Bumpy said softly. "Where he drinks, who he knows, where he sleeps, who he thinks he is." Frank nodded. By midnight, Bumpy walked back to the table and resumed his seat as if nothing had happened. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The men around him noticed the subtle change in his voice, the slight tightening of his jaw. They understood without explanation that something serious was unfolding somewhere in Harlem. By the time the meeting ended at 10:30 p.m., the city outside had grown darker. Bumpy stepped into his car, the door closing with a dull, heavy sound. As the vehicle moved through Manhattan's streets, he stared forward, silent. The driver did not speak. Everyone who worked for Bumpy Johnson had learned the value of silence. Inside the car, memories surfaced slowly in Bumpy's mind, not of violence but of respect. He had spent decades building his reputation not only through fear, but through rules. Harlem had its code. Families were not touched. Women and children were not disrespected. Those who broke the code paid for it, not loudly, but permanently. 10:47 p.m., the car crossed into Harlem. On the sidewalks, people were still talking. Harlem never slept. Tonight it felt unusually alert. Faces turned as Bumpy's car passed. Some nodded subtly. Others looked away, News traveled fast here, faster than newspapers, faster than police radios. Bumpy entered his townhouse without hesitation. Inside, the house was quiet. Mamie sat in the living room, her posture composed, her expression calm. Their daughter sat beside her, flipping through a magazine. Pretending nothing had happened, Bumpy looked at them both for a long moment. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Mamie nodded. "It was nothing," she said. Bumpy knew it was not nothing. But he did not argue. He kissed Mamie's cheek lightly, then placed his hand briefly on his daughter's shoulder. Neither of them spoke about the incident. They did not need to. At 11:12 p.m., telephone rang. Bumpy answered calmly. Frank's voice came through the line, low and precise. "We found him," Frank said. Bumpy listened without interrupting as Frank recited the man's name, habits, and address. Every detail was delivered like a report. When Frank finished, there was a brief silence. "Good," Bumpy said quietly. He hung up the phone and looked out the window toward the streets of Harlem. Somewhere in the distance, sirens echoed faintly. Jazz music drifted through the night air. The city continued to breathe, unaware that a decision had already been made. And in that quiet moment, New York moved one step closer to a story it would never fully understand. The night had deepened over Harlem, wrapping the streets in shadows and neon light. By 25 a.m. on Sunday, June 14, 1964, most of the city slept, but Harlem remained awake, breathing through jazz clubs, late night diners, and quiet backroom conversations. Something invisible was moving through the neighborhood, something people felt but could not see. The man who had caused the trouble sat inside a narrow bar on Lenox Avenue, leaning against the counter with a half-empty glass in his hand. The place smelled of smoke and cheap whiskey. A few men played cards at a corner table, their laughter forced and uneven. The bartender wiped glasses slowly, avoiding eye contact with anyone for too long. At first, the man felt proud of himself. He told his friends exaggerated stories about the evening, laughing too loudly, slurring his words. In his mind, it had been nothing more than a joke, a moment of reckless bravado. He did not understand Harlem. He did not understand that in some places, words carried weight far beyond sound. Outside, a black sedan rolled quietly down the street. Its engine purred softly, almost politely, as it slowed near the bar. The headlights did not linger. The car stopped across the street, blending into the darkness like it had always been there. Two men stepped out, their movements calm, unhurried. They were dressed neatly, their shoes clean, their faces expressionless. They did not look dangerous, they looked deliberate. Inside the bar, the atmosphere began to change. The man felt it before he understood it. Conversations around him softened. Someone at the card table stopped laughing. The bartender placed a glass down a little too carefully. The man looked around, confused by the sudden tension in the room. He took another sip of his drink, trying to ignore the feeling creeping up his spine. Minutes passed. The door of the bar opened briefly as someone stepped outside, then closed again. The man noticed that fewer people were looking at him now. Instead, they looked past him, toward the door or down at their hands. Harlem had a way of signaling danger without words. Restless, the man stood up and walked toward the exit. The cool night air hit his face as he stepped onto the sidewalk. The street was quieter than before, almost unnaturally so. The distant sound of music drifted from somewhere far away, but the block itself felt empty. He lit a cigarette with shaky hands. Across the street, the black sedan remained still. The man did not recognize the two figures standing near it. They were not staring at him. They were not approaching him. They simply stood there, as if waiting for something that did not require urgency. A sudden chill passed through him. He looked up and down the street. No one he knew was nearby. The bar behind him had gone silent. Even the bartender avoided looking through the window. For the first time that night, he felt afraid. He took a step forward, then stopped. One of the men across the street shifted slightly, adjusting his coat. Their eyes met briefly, not with anger, not with threat, with something colder. Understanding came too late. The man turned back toward the bar, but the door felt heavier than before. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle. He sensed movement behind him, heard footsteps that did not hurry. What happened next was never written in newspapers. No official report captured the full truth. By morning, there were no dramatic headlines, no public spectacle. Only rumors. When dawn approached, Harlem began to stir again. Street vendors returned to their corners. Taxi drivers lit their first cigarettes of the day. Shop owners raised metal shutters slowly. But something had changed. In whispers exchanged between barbers and bartenders, between gamblers and musicians, the story spread, not in detail, but in meaning. People spoke in fragments, in cautious tones. "He crossed a line." Bumpy heard about it. That's all it took. No one needed to explain further. Later that morning, the bar on Lenox Avenue opened as usual. The bartender poured drinks, pretending nothing unusual had happened. The card players returned to their table. Life continued, but one chair remained empty, and Harlem understood that this was not coincidence. Somewhere in the city, Bumpy Johnson sat quietly, his morning routine unchanged. He read the newspaper, drank his tea, and listened to the radio like any other man. There was no celebration in his eyes, no visible satisfaction, only certainty, because in Harlem messages were rarely spoken aloud. They were felt, and that night a message had been delivered, silently, efficiently, and in a way New York would never officially record, but never forget. By late morning on Sunday, June 14, 1964, New York felt strangely restless. The city was used to noise, chaos, and headlines, but this time there was something different in the air, something quieter, heavier, harder to explain. People sensed that something had happened, even if no one could clearly say what it was. In Harlem, rumors moved faster than cars. Shopkeepers stood in their doorways longer than usual, watching the streets instead of customers. Taxi drivers leaned out of their windows, trading half-sentences with pedestrians. Inside barber shops, conversations dropped to whispers when certain names were mentioned. Nobody spoke openly, yet everyone seemed to know. Some said the man had vanished overnight. Others claimed he had been seen arguing with strangers near Lenox Avenue. A few insisted they had heard police sirens in the early hours of the morning, but no one offered proof. In Harlem, proof was rarely required when the meaning was already understood. By 11:48 a.m., the tension had reached beyond Harlem. A precinct in Upper Manhattan, a group of detectives sat around a cluttered desk, listening to reports coming in over a crackling radio. The information was vague, fragmented, and incomplete. There was no official complaint, no clear victim, no obvious crime scene. Yet something about the reports unsettled them. "This smells like Harlem business," one detective muttered. Another shook his head. "If it is, we won't get anything out of anyone." They knew the pattern. When certain names were involved, witnesses forgot what they had seen, bartenders remembered nothing, and neighbors suddenly became deaf and blind. Harlem had its own rules, and the police had learned long ago that some walls could not be broken by questions. Meanwhile, newspapers began to sense a story. Reporters called sources, scanned police logs, and listened to whispers from informants. But every lead ended in uncertainty. There were no dramatic photos, no confirmed facts, no statements from officials. Only rumors tied loosely to the shadowy world of organized crime. In a newsroom downtown, an editor sighed and tossed a note into the trash. "Not enough evidence," he said. "We can't print rumors." And so, New York remained officially ignorant. Back in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson's townhouse stood quiet behind iron gates. Inside, the atmosphere was calm, almost serene. Sunlight filtered through heavy curtains as Bumpy sat in his favorite chair, a cup of tea resting in his hand. The radio played soft music, blending with the ticking of a clock on the wall. Mame Johnson moved through the house gracefully, as if nothing unusual had occurred. She arranged flowers in a vase, adjusted a picture frame, and walked past Bumpy without speaking about the previous night. Their daughter sat at the dining table, doing schoolwork, her expression thoughtful but composed. To anyone watching from outside, it looked like an ordinary Sunday morning. But nothing about Bumpy Johnson's life was ordinary. Bumpy listened to the radio without really hearing it. His thoughts were elsewhere, not on revenge, not on anger, but on balance. Harlem had survived because of rules. Those rules had to be protected. Disrespect was not personal, it was structural. If one man could insult his family without consequence, others would follow. And Harlem's fragile order would begin to crack. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply existed in quiet certainty. Around noon, Frank Lucas arrived at the townhouse. He entered without ceremony and sat across from Bumpy. Neither man spoke at first. Silence was their language. "People are talking," Frank said finally. "They always do." Bumpy replied calmly. Frank nodded. Police asked a few questions. "Nothing serious." "They won't find anything," Bumpy said. Frank looked at him carefully. "You sure?" Bumpy met his gaze without hesitation. Harlem knows how to stay quiet. Frank leaned back slightly, understanding the deeper meaning. Harlem's silence was not fear alone. It was loyalty, tradition, and survival. Outside, children played on the sidewalks. Couples walked hand in hand. Vendors sold fruit and newspapers. Life continued with stubborn normality. But beneath the surface, the city felt altered. By evening, the whispers had spread across boroughs. People in Brooklyn and the Bronx heard fragments of the story. Some exaggerated it, others dismissed it. Yet the name, Bumpy Johnson, kept appearing in conversations, spoken carefully, like a word that carried weight. New York had not witnessed a public spectacle. There were no dramatic headlines, no courtroom trials, no visible chaos. Instead, the city experienced something far more unsettling, a quiet reminder that power did not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it moved through the streets silently, and on that Sunday in 1964, New York began to understand that one careless insult in Harlem could ripple across the entire city without leaving a single official trace. Monday morning arrived in Harlem with an unusual stillness. The sky above New York was pale and quiet, as if the city itself were holding its breath. At 7:30 a.m. on June 15, 1964, the streets slowly filled with familiar sounds. Metal shutters rising, footsteps on sidewalks, distant horns. But beneath the routine rhythm, something invisible had changed. People felt it before they understood it. In a small cafe near 125th Street, men sat around steaming cups of coffee, speaking in low voices. The radio played softly in the background, but no one paid attention to the music. Instead, they listened to each other. "You heard what happened?" one man asked quietly. The other nodded without asking for details. In Harlem, details were dangerous. Meaning was enough. Across the street, a newspaper vendor stacked fresh copies of the morning papers. The headlines were ordinary politics, sports, international news. There was no mention of Harlem, no dramatic story, no shocking revelation. To the rest of New York, nothing unusual had happened over the weekend. But Harlem knew better. In a barber shop nearby, scissors paused mid-air as customers exchanged glances. Someone mentioned a name, then quickly lowered his voice. Another man shook his head slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "That's what happens when you forget where you are," he murmured. Life continued, yet it felt as if the neighborhood had collectively absorbed a lesson. Meanwhile, in a quiet townhouse a few blocks away, Bumpy Johnson sat at his dining table, reading the newspaper with deliberate calm. The morning light touched the edges of his suit, highlighting the lines of his composed face. A cup of tea rested beside him, untouched. Mamie Johnson moved gracefully through the room, her expression serene. She had not spoken about the incident since Saturday night, and neither had Bumpy. Between them existed an understanding deeper than words. Their daughter prepared for school, flipping through her books, trying to return to the comfort of ordinary life. To an outsider, the scene looked peaceful, almost mundane. But peace, in Harlem, was rarely accidental. Bumpy folded the newspaper carefully and placed it on the table. He stared at the wall for a moment, as if listening to something beyond sound. Outside, a car passed slowly. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed briefly, then faded. Frank Lucas arrived shortly after. He entered the house quietly and sat across from Bumpy without ceremony. The two men exchanged a brief look, no handshake, no unnecessary words. "The city's talking," Frank said. Bumpy nodded slightly. "Let them." "Police checked around Lenox Avenue," Frank continued. "They didn't find much." "They never do," Bumpy replied calmly. Frank hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward. "People are scared," he said. Bumpy looked at him steadily. "No," he said. "They're remembering." Frank understood the difference. Fear was temporary. Memory was permanent. Outside, Harlem carried on with its daily life, but subtle changes were everywhere. Strangers were more careful with their words. Conversations ended abruptly when certain topics arose. Men who once laughed loudly now spoke with restraint. Even those who had nothing to do with the incident felt its echo. By midday, the story had spread beyond Harlem. In Brooklyn, someone mentioned it in a pool hall. In the Bronx, a rumor traveled through a small social club. In Manhattan, a few journalists heard whispers, but found nothing they could publish. The truth existed only in fragments, scattered across the city like smoke. New York had not witnessed violence, chaos, or spectacle. Instead, it witnessed silence, and silence was more frightening than noise. That afternoon, Bumpy walked briefly through Harlem streets, his presence subtle but undeniable. People noticed him without staring. Some nodded respectfully. Others stepped aside instinctively. He did not smile, did not speak loudly, did not display power. He simply existed, and that was enough. Years later, people would still speak about that weekend in 1964, not with certainty, but with reverence. They would say that a single insult had changed a man's fate and reminded an entire city of Harlem's invisible laws. They would say that New York learned something important that summer, that words could be dangerous. That respect was not optional, and that, when Bumpy Johnson's family was disrespected, the city did not hear thunder or see lightning. It felt something far more unsettling. A quiet, irreversible shift in the balance of power, and from that Monday forward, Harlem never forgot it.